Well, welcome and thank you for joining us for a very important event as we are nervously waiting for 9 unelected, unresponsive, appointed individuals to proclaim from atop the mountain what our new laws will be as we're here in June. And the Supreme Court still has 18 decisions to release. We know only exactly a year ago how much damage these 9 unelected, completely out of touch from the normal small d democratic systems we have, just how much damage they can do. But before I go too much further into discussing this, I would be remiss if I didn't say to the special guests who are behind me and from whom you will shortly hear, welcome to Philadelphia. Welcome to our nation's birthplace. It is an honor to have you on this important and crucial bus tour throughout our country. I also just want to say a brief thank you to our host here. I mean, you have a big bus, very big bus, for a great cause, so I had to find a space to accommodate here. And our friends at IATSE Local 8, Matt McIntyre is right there. Thank you, Matt, for hosting us. Deeply appreciated. And IATSE, by the way, has always been there on the fight for justice here locally and beyond. But in terms of back to the Supreme Court, you know, I hope everyone goes out, and believe me, I get no residuals from this. I don't even know the author personally. But David Kaplan wrote a book called The Most Dangerous Branch. And the idea is that originally, our third branch of government, supposed to be co-equal, but it was designed in a way that one of our nation's founders wrote, it should be the least dangerous branch. That is not the America we live in almost a quarter of a millennium later. The Supreme Court has become, indeed, as the title states, the most dangerous branch. Casually and arrogantly overruling law after law passed by the people through their elected representatives. Now look, I serve in Congress. I understand sometimes our approval rate is worse than almost anything, lower than the basement sometimes. And sometimes I think that's well-deserved. But the reality is, as frustrating as Congress can be, whether one agrees with an individual president or not, those members of Congress and the president are elected by the people. They can be held accountable by the people. That is not what we have with the Supreme Court. This Supreme Court has routinely overthrown precedent, sometimes precedents that date back over a century, because they arrogantly believe they know better. Now, some might think, well, that's the way democracy works. Except no other Western democracy has a Supreme Court that has usurped for itself this amount of raw power. It is because they are unelected and we can't hold them accountable. That's the key second part of this. Now, some of you have probably heard most recently about Clarence Thomas's, quote, good friends. He and others likely on the court are able to get away with what we now know, tremendous ethics violations that would get me, if I did that, investigated by the House Ethics Committee and kicked out of Congress. Right now, there is no accountability for Clarence Thomas and the others who have engaged in similar behavior. Because the Supreme Court, unlike every other court that exists in the United States, the Supreme Court has no ethics body to which it reports. I mean, what a gig. You don't even have to follow the rules. You don't have to worry about re-election. You can serve for decades. My friends, that is not representative democracy. That is a threat to representative democracy. So, in my view, one of the most important things we can do in Congress is to push for dramatic reform of the Supreme Court. And I'm sure many of the folks behind me will detail some of those initiatives. I'm a co-sponsor on a number of pieces of legislation that would reform the court, rein it in, and bring it back as a co-equal branch of government instead of one that routinely overrules the will of the people through its dictates. So with that, I will pause here and bring up our next speaker, just a wonderful state senator. We represent some of the we have some overlapping neighborhoods here in Philadelphia, but someone who has both the head and the heart for the position he holds, State Senator Nikil Saval.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Good morning. It is a privilege to be here with the coalition members from a just majority to discuss the urgent need for Supreme Court expansion. Likewise, along with the Congressman, would like to welcome our guests, our special guests to Philadelphia. Thank you so much for being here. It's a privilege to be here with the coalition members from a just majority to discuss the urgent need for Supreme Court expansion. The stakes couldn't be higher because under the Roberts Court, the future we want is unconstitutional. Now, this statement may seem paradoxical, but allow me to explain. The decisions made under the Roberts Court have demonstrated a radical departure from the principles enshrined in our Constitution, threatening the equal administration of justice under the law. And worse, they foreclose the possibility of using the democratic process to fight for a habitable planet, for a just economic system, and for health care for all. The future we want is an open, multiracial democracy is unconstitutional. The Roberts Court has worked time and time again to make our system of government less democratic. The disastrous Citizens United ruling unleashed a torrent of unregulated money into our political system, drowning out the voices of everyday Americans. And in Shelby County, the court struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, opening the floodgates to discriminatory voting laws that disproportionately affect black and brown voters. Finally, in Rucho, the Chief Justice himself wrote an opinion stating that partisan gerrymandering claims cannot be litigated in federal courts under the U.S. Constitution. These decisions are an affront to the very notion of equal representation under the law. The future we want as a country with a just economic system is unconstitutional. The Roberts Court has attacked workers' rights at every time, using its rulings in Cedar Point Nursery and Janus to dismantle labor unions and make it more difficult for workers to organize. These cases overturn long-standing precedents recognizing the rights of workers under federal law and under the Constitution. Finally, the future we want, or not finally, but the future we want on a habitable planet is unconstitutional. Just this year, the Roberts Court in Sackett severely restricted the EPA's authority under the Clean Water Act, only 1 year after doing the same to the agency on the topic of carbon emissions in West Virginia versus EPA. Justice Kagan, reacting to these rulings, wrote that the court had, quote, appointed itself as the national decision maker on environmental policy. And given the Roberts Court love for corporations and nihilism towards our climate, that self-appointed position means disaster for us and our children and our planet. And the future we want with universal health care is unconstitutional. The Dobbs decision is an attack on health care, on reproductive rights, and on women everywhere. It is the culmination of an anti-democratic, decades-long project by the radical right to impose their warped ideology on the entire country. It cannot and should not be respected. Considering these attacks, court expansion is not a radical proposition, but a rational one. It is a necessary step to restore balance and ensure the court resumes its role of administering equal justice under the law. Expanding the Supreme Court has happened multiple times throughout history, is constitutional and appropriate, and must be done if we are to counteract the undue influence of a small, unrepresented group of right-wing justices who have held power for far too long. Thank you again for joining me here in my district, the birthplace of democracy. Let's expand the court. And now it is my great honor to introduce my good friend, someone who has done incredible work for this city long before she became an elected official and has done so much more under her work as city council member, Kendra Brooks.
Thank you so much, Senator Saval and Congressman Boyle, and to all our guests that are here today. Good morning, everyone. I am Councilmember Kendra Brooks, and I'm happy to be joining you all this morning. It's impressive to see such a large coalition of people and organizations working together to safeguard our democracy. A few years ago, expanding the Supreme Court was considered a fringe idea. But we're here today because over 30 organizations across the country, from Black Voters Matter to Planned Parenthood Action, have joined the Just Majority Coalition to expand the court. This coalition is broad. It includes people fighting for gun control, for the environment, for reproductive freedom, and for workers' rights. It includes Black folks, Asian and Pacific American folks, and people from different parts of this country. The fact that all of these diverse groups of people, all of these organizations are fighting for our future, are coming together around a common cause, shows me that expanding the court is no longer a fringe idea. It is an idea whose time has come. When we have reached a point in history in our country where the decisions of our government do not reflect the will of the people. The majority of people in our country are in favor of gun control. But the Supreme Court rules in favor of the powerful gun lobby. The majority of people in this country want to hold corporations accountable for the damage they do to people and our planet. But the Supreme Court rules in favor of wealthy corporations. The majority of people in our country believe abortion should be legal, but the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and pulled a rug out on the millions of people who depend on reproductive care. And here's where I see the problem. The majority of people in the country are not rich enough to influence the Supreme Court justice. Instead, it's a very small minority, the owners of wealthy corporations, who are making the rules for the rest of us. And that's why we're coming together here today, from all walks of life. We're here to show that we are the majority. We're here to speak out against the wealthy few, and reclaim the Supreme Court that serves all of us. And we're here because our country is a democracy, and we won't let our democracy slip away. In a democracy, it is the people who make the laws, and it is the people who change them. We have changed the Supreme Court many times in the past, and we can change it in our future. As long as we keep building people power, I believe that we can do it. Now, I'd like to introduce someone who stands for what it means to build people power and what it means to make real change. Please join me in welcoming civil rights leader Martin Luther King III.
Congressman Boyle, Senator Saval, thank you for the introduction, Councilwoman Brooks, to Color of Change President Rashad Robinson, Professor Kermit Roosevelt, and to my life partner, my wife, the president of the Drum Major Institute, Arndrea Waters King, and to our daughter also, Yolanda Renee King. It is said that the time is always right to do that which is right. And there is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come. It has already been stated that we are here to talk about the expansion of the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, that perhaps was designed to be one of the pillars of the three levels of government: the executive level, the legislative level, and the Supreme Court, the judicial level of government. But it feels as if, in relationship to these three distinct branches, one branch has supreme authority and no ability to be held accountable. I don't know that that's what the framers of our laws' intentions were. But we often hear "we the people," which means all of us have an opportunity to participate. But at this particular time in history, this is the 60th year of the anniversary and commemoration of the March on Washington. 60 years ago, in August 28th, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his vision for our nation and world. And as I stand here today, and we will soon be coming upon that 60th anniversary, where we're calling on people of good conscience from throughout our nation and our world to come to Washington to join us, not to commemorate, but to re-engage, because now is the time for justice to happen in our nation. What I know is it takes a few good women and men to bring about change. Dad, through his leadership, showed us that, and my mother, through her leadership, showed us that. I would like to be standing here believing that certain things had not gone awry in our nation. But when you look at the fact that democracy, every day, there are things that are being done to erode democracy. And an ultimate decision will eventually, once again, get to the courts. It has already been stated that in 2013, the Voting Rights Act, the process began to decimate it. In 2022, women's rights have been disassembled, mostly by a group of men, by and large, who chose to decide they're going to tell women what they should do. It's a sad commentary. And then, when you talk about guns, which we all should be concerned in, whether we are in this city of Philadelphia of brotherly love, or whether we're in my state of Georgia, or in Texas, or in Florida, or anywhere in this country, where guns seem to be more important than the preservation of human life. And our Supreme Court will continue to reaffirm that. One of the remedies that we have is to perhaps expand the court. And as has been stated, it has been done several times. So it is not constitutionally established that 9 members would be there only. United States Congress can add 2 at any time. So now is the time. We know this is a marathon and not a sprint. But we also know that when people come together, change occurs. And so now I want to present my wife, my life partner, my much better half, and the mother of our beautiful child. Arndrea Waters King.
Good afternoon. You know, in 1979, in broad daylight, there was in South Carolina an anti-Klan demonstration that was getting ready to happen. And in broad daylight, the Klan came and shot and killed 8 anti-Klan demonstrators with television cameras rolling. It was the first time in modern history that the Klan and the neo-Nazis worked together. And from that incident, there was an organization formed called the National Anti-Klan Network, started by Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was one of Martin's father's strongest lieutenants, as well as Ann Braden, who was mentioned in the letter from a Birmingham jail as a white Southern woman that was in the freedom struggle with all black people. That organization then became the Center for Democratic Renewal, because the founders of that organization realized that white supremacy and neo-Nazis and Klan members were the antithesis to what a democracy should stand for. I worked for that organization. I worked for Reverend C.T. Vivian and Ann Braden for 12 years. And we monitored hate groups and hate crimes such as the Klan, neo-Nazis. We went into communities to prevent hate crimes. Fast forward to 2023, the same philosophies that we were studying when we were reading about the Klan and neo-Nazis and looking at all of their pamphlets and paraphernalia, now is what our Supreme Court is legislating. Those very same ideas that in the late 80s and early 90s are now being legislated by the Supreme Court, which is why I can stand before you and unfortunately, but authoritatively say that oppression is being legislated in our country. And we are here together because we are unwavering in our stand for democracy. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the triple evils of racism and bigotry and violence and poverty. Those triple evils, again, we stand before you to say that oppression is being legislated. His granddaughter, his only grandchild, at 15 years old, is now sitting with fewer rights than the day that she was born. She was born in 2008. In 2013, the Supreme Court decimated the Voting Rights Act, the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement. In 2022, of course, she as a female child lost her reproductive freedoms. A girl child that was born last year in this country was born with fewer rights than her grandmother, her mother, and her great-grandmother. That has not happened since the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the passage of black codes. And that is why we are here together. We understand that democracy is not about special rights for the few. It is about equal rights for all of us. We are now at a time when instead of regulating guns, the Supreme Court has chosen to regulate women. We're at a time when voting rights are literally being erased. History is being erased. And yes, the Supreme Court we had a small victory last week. But what I've said is even a broke clock shows the correct time twice a day. That doesn't mean that that clock does not need to be fixed. And so we understand also that democracy is not a finished product. It is something that we, the people, have always pressed to make a reality. The Supreme Court is not binded by law or by Congress to operate with 9 justices or in the way in which it has. So, of course, what we're asking may seem a little bit right now impossible. But it certainly looked impossible at the beginning of the bus boycott when black people decided that they were going to walk for 366 days rather than to continue to be subjugated to second-class citizenry. It looked impossible when you look at all of the movements that have happened since that time. But it always has been a few good women and men at the forefront of democracy to continue to press this country where she should be. Above the Supreme Court are written the words equality under the law. And what we are simply saying is that no one should be above the law, including the highest court of law. And so now we are proclaiming that this is the beginning, but this has always been a movement of faith, and we will not give up, we will not give out, and we will not give in until democracy is very real in this country. I'm going to bring up our daughter, Yolanda Renee King, who at 15 is spending part of her summer instead of at camps and having fun. Her fun is traveling with mom and dad and bringing up to her peers the importance of this issue. So now, Yolanda Renee King.
Thank you for that introduction. During this time, I like to think that we are in the scene in that movie where you're on the train and the passengers get disconnected from the train. And instead of going forward, we're going backwards. And during that time, it can be a very hard time. And a lot of times we see discouragement and the leads giving up because they're going backwards, and once they go backwards, there may be a cliff, and then that's it. But then somehow, they usually end up finding a way where they are, and they end up thinking outside the box, and they find a solution, and somehow they get recentered almost, and find a way out of the train, out of the backwards train. And so I think that's what we really have to do right now, because it feels like we're going backwards. We're going backwards in time. We're going backwards on the train of time. But it seems that always whenever there's change, as we saw a lot of people came out back in 2020, and after George Floyd, a lot of people came out and spoke out, there always is backlash. There always is a disconnect from the train. And so this is normal, and this is something that does happen. But now what we must do is find a way to stop the train. And I think that we will. And it historically we always have. And I know during this time it seems very discouraging, but you have to have perseverance when doing this work. And you also have to hold leaders accountable, which is why right now we are running campaigns to encourage the expansion in the Supreme Court. The last time I was at the last stop before last week back in Memphis. And I remember we were in front of a courthouse, and in front of the courthouse, there were messages engraved like equality and justice. And even in the Supreme Court's building and in all of the courthouses all over the country, we see justice. We see the symbol of justice. We see equality. And to me, I find it quite ironic that those who are running the rules and who are supposed to and have made an oath to make sure that there is justice and equality as judges should do, don't seem to be acting upon these values. And so it is also our responsibility to keep on pushing, to put pressure. And it seems very hard, but you also must celebrate the small victories. My mom stated there was a small victory last week, meaning that it seems almost that in some ways, while the train is still going fast, while the train is still accelerating, we're going slower, and so we need to find the brake. And also right away, may I remind you that when you hit a brake for something, it doesn't stop right away, especially when it's going really, really fast. It slows down, and it gets slower and slower until it finally brakes. And so we must do that. And so we must continue to do what we are doing, because if this didn't work, then why did we see all the great change that happened back in the civil rights movement? They kept going. They had perseverance, even when it seemed like it was the end. They kept going. And so now I would like to end my remarks by introducing a great leader with a great message. And I would like to introduce the president of Color of Change, Rashad Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you for those words, Yolanda, and a reminder of how we have to keep moving forward. To all the other speakers, to the elected officials here in this great city where my organization has been able to do so much work over the years. I'm so happy to be here. My grandmother used to always say about rain that it is an opportunity to wash away the things that need to be washed away. So I do think that there's something prophetic about the rain in this moment. But I do want to open up this conversation by saying at Color of Change, I lead an organization, a next generation racial justice organization that was founded in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina, that was caused by bad decision makers and turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. And the thing about Katrina, the thing about these moments that deeply connect to democracy and why we are here today is because in those moments they illustrate things that we already knew: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and all the ways in which the powerful and the elite have been able to set the rules. But at the heart of Katrina, no one was nervous about disappointing black people. Government, corporations, and media. And so our organization was founded to channel the hopes and aspirations and demands of everyday people to hold institutions accountable. And in so many ways, that's what democracy should be about. To be able to express our will for a better future, regardless of whether we are privileged or vulnerable, in the majority or the minority, or in favor or out of favor with whoever may be in power. And it's constantly been a fight. It's constantly been a struggle. But we can't mistake the presence of our issues, the visibility of our issues, for our actual power. And right now, the rules are rigged against us actually being able to make things happen, against all the work we do in elections to actually add up to the type of change that people go to the polls to make happen. And in so many ways, that's what we have to fight for. Because if we have an unelected body of people more accountable to the rich corporations who put them there than everyday people, then we will continue to go backwards in our democracy. We like to tell ourselves a story in this country about continual progress, about continuing to move forward. But over the last several years, we have seen this court drag us back by putting its hand on the scale for big corporations, bringing us back by putting its hand on the scale. Wow, this is serious. This is serious. This is serious, y'all. This is serious. Right now, washing away what needs to be washed away. But we know that we... All right. We know that our work here is to be able to set a course for what is possible, to be able to make demands on a system that actually works for us, to recognize that democracy and our systems and structures have constantly changed over time when people have demanded more. We've expanded the vote and access to the vote based off of age, based off of gender, based off of race. Time and time again, we've expanded and changed the way we elect people to various bodies. We've made these changes as we've recognized the flaws in our system. And that is what's at stake today. We have to look at all avenues for court reform, including expanding the court, if we're going to get to a place where we can actually make sure that our representatives, that our voices actually matter. In a couple of days, we will remember the legacy of slavery in this country by celebrating Juneteenth, a moment when Black folks got to hear about their emancipation. And this month we are also celebrating Pride, that moment at a bar in New York where people had had enough and said no more to police violence and to surveillance. And as we think about both these moments, they do illustrate that people will fight for what is possible. People will make demands for a better tomorrow. People will constantly work to change the rules that govern them. And we have to stand and create the avenues for that to be possible. And that today is so much about what we are doing. That is what we have to demand out of the courts. And that is the possibility for what I hope this tour can continue to create. An avenue to make the type of changes that make all of our voices heard. It's my pleasure to bring up Professor Kermit Roosevelt to take us home.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with such an extraordinary group of speakers. And I have basically just 2 points to make. The first is Supreme Court expansion is actually not that radical. This is a power that the Constitution gives to Congress. If Congress and the President have different visions of the Constitution from the Supreme Court, they're supposed to push against it. This is just schoolhouse rock. This is basic civics. This is separation of powers, checks and balances. That's how it's supposed to go. So the first point, court expansion is not as radical as you might think. It's contemplated by our constitutional system. As you've heard, it's been done in the past. Second point, I want to say something about why we are at this moment, how we got here, why we have a Supreme Court giving us these radical, unpopular decisions. And the answer is the appointments process is broken. So if each president got to appoint the same number of Supreme Court justices, you would have a Supreme Court that more or less was in step with the vision of the American people. But that hasn't happened. Supreme Court appointments are way out of line with the result of presidential elections. So the first George Bush got 2 appointments in 4 years. Bill Clinton got 2 in 8 years. Second George Bush got 2. Obama got 2. Then Trump comes along and gets 3 in 4 years. So up to the Biden presidency, we've had 4 Democratic terms and 4 appointments. We've had 4 Republican terms and 7 appointments. And it wouldn't matter so much who was making the appointments if they were just picking good judges. And it used to be that way. David Souter was a Republican appointee. John Paul Stevens, Earl Warren, the Warren Court. Earl Warren was a Republican appointee. But recently, things have changed. The Republicans started looking for extreme ideologues, and that's what they got. So now we have a 6-3 majority on this court, appointed by people who lost 5 of the last 8 presidential elections, who lost the popular vote 7 of the last 8 elections. And they put extreme judges on the court, even though the American people want something different. And that's why we are where we are now. And you might think, well, if the American people want something different, Democrats can keep winning elections and they'll get the court back. But that's not true. First, justices decide when they're going to retire. And Republican appointees retire under Republican presidents. And they can lose 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 presidential elections going forward, and they can still hold the court for the next 40 years if they time their retirements right. And I don't think Americans should have to wait 40 years to get back the rights this court has taken away. But there's a second reason that's even more important, which is Republicans know they're a minority party. They know they lost the popular vote 7 out of 8 times. And a lot of states are trying to make it harder now for Americans to vote. And the Supreme Court is helping them strangle the democratic process. The Supreme Court is taking away the laws that protect our voting rights. You heard about this. The Supreme Court is interfering in the political process with decisions like Shelby County, decisions like Citizens United. The Supreme Court is undoing a lot of the gains of the civil rights movement, most crucially with the democratic process and the progress we made towards a real multiracial democracy. So that is the most important issue as far as I'm concerned, this attack on the democratic process. We should have a Supreme Court that reflects the vision of the American people, but you will never know what the American people want if they're not allowed to vote. We need a Supreme Court that's going to protect the democratic process instead of attacking it. And that's why we need court expansion. So, thank you. I'm now going to hand it back to Representative Boyle to start the Q&A period.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, I don't know what everyone's talking about. It is always sunny in Philadelphia. Well, I want to thank, I couldn't help but notice and observe that 2 great historic American family legacies are being upheld by the wonderful spokespeople that we have behind me, as well as those of us who are joining them. So I want to thank everyone. With the alleged thunderstorm we just went through and are going through, I think we lost a couple of our press people. But the hardy souls who remain, if you have any questions, happy to answer them. If not, we can draw this to a close. Thank you very much, and onward.